Welcome to the Eco Blitz. You should be looking for ETD 72 at this point. Basic idea of this, if I get rid of this thing here, is we're going to be going into all the eco topics ahead of the game so that you can get an exposure to those before whenever your exam is going to happen. One of the great tools for that is the lab bench, especially this dissolved oxygen one. So if you feel like that little fish sitting on the radiator and the temperature's going up, then hopefully you paid attention in chemistry because that has a lot to do with dissolved oxygen and the effect of temperature on solubility. But you're going to take that look at that for homework. Now, key things that you need for today's class, you need 9 papers. You're going to have all the ones listed on this. They'll be found in the Google Classroom under Classworks. So you can see that all of those pieces are there for you, and they'll be due in 2 weeks after the spring break. So you can freeze it, look at those. This will also be available in the PowerPoint version of it. Now, things that we need to look at today, of course, has to do with ETD 72. If you look at that wolf and the way he's looking at my little Benny, you know why people don't like predators. Because in the old days, we were prey. That, of course, has greatly changed, but we need to take a look at the story of one wonderful place called Yellowstone. Now, one of the things you can find in Yellowstone is you can find wolves, you can find elk, and you can find coyotes. Here's what I want you to do in your ETD. I want you to draw and explain using a graph, show how elk and wolf and coyote populations have changed in Yellowstone National Park in the last 100 years. And make sure you explain why each change in your graph is represented. Now, at this point, normally you would have about 10 minutes to draw it out, try it out, figure it out. So pause me and then come back and see how you did on it, right? We're just going to jump in right now. So if we look at this, one of the things that we can see is I'm going to use different colors today. One of the colors I'm going to use is I'm going to use blue. And I'm going to use blue to represent elk. If we look at Yellowstone, say 1912, all time's going by. If we look at that 100 years ago-ish, the elk population in Yellowstone was about 8,000. And the population, of course, wasn't exactly 8,000. It would waver up and down. That's because, of course, if we look at the elk, what was going on? Well, some years they had good years. More of their babies survived. Some years, if you've been to Yellowstone in the winter, it's harsh. More of those babies died. Or there was more rain or less food, and all those things that, of course, affect their population. It's a dynamic population. Sometimes more live, sometimes more die. That allows them to reach what's called a K, a carrying capacity. It means that's the amount of elk that basically could be supported by the Yellowstone ecosystem. Then around 1924, something drastically changed. Suddenly, the elk population skyrocketed. And anytime you see a graph that looks like that kind of growth where it's skyrocketing, that is exponential growth. And exponential growth is because babies are having babies, and then those babies can very quickly make their own babies, so a population can rise quickly. Now, it doesn't rise infinitely as some humans think we can do. What it does, of course, is it reaches a point where, well, suddenly you run out of food. And as you run out of food and you run out of resources, babies start to die, and the population doesn't grow forever. Somebody should tell the economists that. Now, if we look at this, anytime you see this S-shaped curve, that is what is known as logistical growth. It's logistical because it's logical growth. It means that you can only grow so far and then resources become depleted. But somebody please tell the politicians. Now, this means that this reached a brand new carrying capacity, a new K, right? And over time, of course, by 1995, there was another huge change in the population. The population suddenly dropped. The scientists got really worried as the elk population dropped off like crazy. It dipped lower than it had ever been, and then it came back up and it reached a new carrying capacity. Now, if you can think ahead, you can probably figure out that that probably has something to do with predators. And the major predator, I'm going to use red, for elk in Yellowstone is the wolf. If we look at wolf populations, of course, you would never find 8,000 wolves in any valley like Yellowstone. There's just not enough energy in the ecosystem to support that. But we can scale it and say, well, it's about 80 wolves, right? And this could be like 160 wolves. Now, one thing that we can see is wolves predate on elk. Eating them, of course, they mainly feed on the young. If they kill the elk's babies, that would cause the elk population to decrease. Well, wolves were naturally found in Yellowstone for millions of years, and what we can see is their population also wavered around 80. You can see that it had its ups and downs, its booms and its busts, naturally, because there were years where there was more elk to eat, and more elk meant that you could have more cubs that would actually survive, and with those cubs surviving, they could become wolves and have their own cubs. The problem is, of course, you can see that there's this wonderful lag between the high rise, the boom of the elk, and the boom of the wolves. It's always lagging behind it. What they call that is a lag period. And they're going to ask you to calculate the lag period on the exam. It's basically looking at the difference between, or the average of, the booms and the busts for both the predator and the prey, because they often follow this pattern of a delay where there's a boom in the prey, and that leads to a boom in the predators, and then the predators overeat them, and that causes a cascading fall of the prey, and then if you run out of food, you die out, right? Things changed, though, around 1924. In the early 1900s and late 1800s, humans had moved into the area around Yellowstone. Now, it's the first national park, but around the whole park, you will find huge ranches. One thing ranchers hate, they hate predators. Large predators like the wolves, of course, would naturally go after things like their calves. And that's money, that's business to a rancher. So what the ranchers efficiently did was they poisoned, and in 1924, they shot the very last wolf in Yellowstone Valley. Now, it wasn't a direct shot like that, but you can see that the population dropped off, and basically wolves went locally extinct in 1924. And that is in the Yellowstone Valley, fortunately not the world. And this is because of human hunting, human poisoning of them. They'd lace a carcass, leave it out with things like strychnine, and then the cows would, or the wolves would eat it and then bleed out, right? Rat poison. Now, what that meant, of course, is the predator of the elk had disappeared, and suddenly that meant more babies survived. That's why the elk population skyrocketed and goes up exponential and then reaches new carrying capacity when they started to eat so much of the food and so much of the browsing material that they starved to death. Now, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, and beyond, there was this weird thing that started to develop called ecology. And the idea of ecology was that maybe every organism in an ecosystem has a place. And these ecologists by 1995 had built up enough steam and enough evidence that they actually got the local area and local government and the national park to reintroduce wolves from Canada. Now, when they reintroduced them from Canada, the pack that moved in started very, very small. There's two separate units. And then they very quickly skyrocketed in their population. And they skyrocketed because there was all this elk to eat. So they were eating really, really well. Their cubs were surviving. Even though it's pretty harsh in Yellowstone in the wintertime, they were able to get through it because there was so much food available. That's why the elk population died down. Now, it went so high and the elk dropped so quick because the wolves were just slaughtering them that it actually freaked out the ecologists. They thought, oh, maybe we got this wrong because they're a little too efficient at killing. But then, of course, as nature always does, it found a balance. And that balance meant that as they had overexploited their supply of all of this elk, the cubs started to die. And with reducing the cubs meant the population of wolves eventually lagged behind the elk, as it naturally should. And we get this wonderful lag period occurring again. Now, this makes complete sense because the relationship between elk and wolves is a predator-prey relationship. The wolf being the predator, the elk being the prey. And this is a natural prey cycle that we're seeing, and it tends to show that lag period where one booms, the other booms, and then one busts, and the other falls behind. In ecology, we like to use relationships like symbiosis, and this is a plus negative, meaning that the wolves benefit, and the elk, of course, are the prey, and they, of course, are hurt by that. But you can see it also controls their population and prevents them from overfeeding. So there's some mutualism going on, too, a plus-plus relationship. Now, what does this have to do with things like coyotes? If we look at coyotes, I'm going to use green for coyotes. Coyotes are naturally found in the western United States and now all over the U.S. The coyote population was never at the level of the wolves. It was around half of it, say 40 coyotes, right? And they, of course, showed fluctuation because there's good years and there's bad years. But what happened, of course, was when if you've ever been to Yellowstone and if you've ever seen a coyote and a wolf interact, you know what happens. I once saw a coyote actually approaching a wolf kill, and the wolf ran down the hill and bit the coyote in the head and killed it right there. Didn't eat it, just killed it. And that's because, of course, this represents competition. Coyotes will prey upon wolf cubs. They'll take them out because they're naturally, of course, going after some of the same prey animals, which is why coyotes tend to focus on smaller prey or feeding off the scraps from what the wolves leave behind. Now, as soon as the wolves disappear, their main competitor is gone. So that means more coyote cubs will survive. And as they survive, their populations went back up. And now they, of course, had enough numbers that they could actually exploit some of those elk babies and kill them off. So their population rose. They reached a new carrying capacity. Then wolves get reintroduced. What happens? Oh, well, the wolves come along and start killing some coyotes, outcompeting them. Their population drops back down and reaches its normal carrying capacity. Because one of the things that we can see here is the wolves and the coyotes, they are in competition. That's a form of symbiosis. This is a negative, where we have competition between two species. This is interspecific competition. And nature kind of hates that. So it knocks it down really quick, where one that's a better competitor, like the wolf, a larger species of canid, can outcompete the other. Now, what this shows is what's a fancy thing called Gauss's law of competitive exclusion. And Gauss's law of competitive exclusion is the basic idea that if you're better, then you make the basketball team and the short guy gets knocked off. But in nature, of course, the short guy gets killed and his babies never get created. So the key thing we can see is this would help to reduce the competition in the long run by reducing the numbers of the competitive species and favoring those that were the most fit, the greatest fitness, right? At the same time, there's another relationship going on. The coyotes also still benefited from this because even though they weren't running the roost anymore in the Yellowstone, they still, of course, had these long winter periods where it's not easy to find things like mice to eat. So this actually benefited the coyotes because now they could feed off of wolf kills. Now, that didn't affect the wolves. It gave them a benefit, and this is called commensalism, where one benefits and the other is not affected at all. Basically, the wolves provide a niche for those coyotes to feed on, to scavenge off their kills in the winter. And then that brought the whole ecosystem back to a balance, not only for the animals, but also for the flora that's there, the plants, that's far more healthy since that time. So hopefully you need to see a couple of things. One of the things that you should notice is that all populations go through cycles, and they are dynamic. Since you had to take chemistry last year, you should notice that this wavy line looks a lot like a chemical reaction reaching equilibrium. They go through boom and bust cycles, which if you watch the stock market, it kind of resembles it because it's a predatory cycle. Eventually, they reach this K, this carrying capacity. And that's when you can see this beautiful S curve. And the S curve, of course, is logical. You can only grow so much before, of course, nature says, hey, you just ran out of resources. You can't keep growing. But once again, humans are going to learn that the hard way. Looks like we are. This is the logistical growth. That logic has to play a role. There is, of course, what Darwin talked about, scarcity, right? Way to go, Chucky D. Now, key things that we should also notice. You're going to get out your notes. You're going to write down some stuff. So this is review items, things that you should have known from way back when you took biology here, whatever it's called nowadays, right? This is the actual graph data. You can see that the numbers are not as fluid, but you can definitely see the lag period between the elk and the wolves. The wolves are on the rise, the elk are in the decline, and you can see the drop in those things. So this is real data simplified for your graph. What makes population cycles dynamic? Well, one thing we can notice is they go through a boom and bust. They reach, of course, dynamic equilibrium. And things that cause them to boom and bust, a big factor is weather. There are hard versus easy winters in Yellowstone or anywhere on Earth where there's more snow or less snow. That means, of course, you could have more rainfall where there's more water to supply for plants and more food for herbivores. You can even have sunspot activity change on an 11-year cycle or the solar output. And if there's less sunshine, that means less primary producers, which means eventually less consumers. So you should be thinking about energy and energy pyramids already. Other things, of course, is food and nutrient availability. The producers run the whole thing. The light determines how they work out. Ask the dinosaurs, right? And of course, they also produce the oxygen, and they can't survive without things like fertilizers, like nitrates and phosphates. Reduce the phosphates by runoff, and a forest dies, just like it is in the Amazon as we cut down it, and then it runs off all the soil that has the phosphates. Predator and prey relationships and interactions are a big one with the lag period. Wolves and elk are a good example. Competition, of course, for limited resources. It can be interspecific or intraspecific between species, right? And within a species, which is very common, human wars. Immigration and emigration. This is the in and out idea. I always remember the I is for the in and the E is for the exit, so emigrating out. And then, of course, you can have birth and death rates, which in fancy terms is the mortality, el morte, and, of course, fertility, how many babies you can make. Different types of graphs that you're sure to see on the exam. One, of course, that's easy to spot. If it's like that, has a slope of like 1, well, that's linear growth. That doesn't tend to happen in nature, right? It'll happen in physics, but not in biological things. What biological things favor is if you make babies, those babies make babies, which make babies, which make babies, and you go exponential. That's what we're doing right now. That's what all species strive for, to make more babies, because, of course, most of them are going to die, as Chucky D said, right? What we typically see in natural systems and on the AAP exam is these beautiful S-curves. This is logistical growth. It goes exponential as you have success and make babies that make babies, and then eventually you run out of resources and you plateau out. You reach dynamic equilibrium, right? You're making and breaking at the same rate. If we look at an example of that, a good one would be the African elephant. Now, throughout the history of the last several million years in Africa, elephants of different species have done very well. But if we look at the African elephant, it was in the hundreds of thousands in Africa throughout it. And then humans showed up. And in the 1800s and early 1900s, people figured out, hey, I want to make a keyboard on my piano. It's got white keys. How do I make that? There's no plastic. Oh, I know. I'll shoot an elephant and takes its tusk. Or they were like, hey, I need a cue ball for my pool table. I know, we'll use elephant ivory. So it was a hot commodity, plus Europeans had just moved into that area and were shooting them like crazy, and they almost knocked them out to complete extinction. By the 1920s, it was pretty clear that this was so bad, they started to set up hunting reserves and national parks like Kruger National Park, where they were protected inside of it. Once they started protecting elephants, they did what all species do. They started making babies, and the babies made babies, and that led to exponential growth. Now, what happened, though, of course, was by the 1960s, there had been so many elephants that had been created by this population boom that what they ended up doing was going, oh, maybe we got to go through a cull. There's too many. They're breaking out and eating all the crops in the areas around it. So they went out and they slaughtered them. Basically, what they would do is they would find a baby, shoot the baby. Then, of course, the mom and the whole herd would come in and they used machine guns to slaughter them. What they found out that was not the best management tool, but it brought it down to a low part. Eventually, they figured out that they needed to connect the national parks, which is what they're trying to do right now. Well, some are still trying to make ornaments out of ivory. Sad story, but true, right? This is exponential, brought back to logistical because, well, humans were their predator. If we look at another one, of course, the dynamic part of it is you can think about the ins and the outs. I think of it as In-N-Out Burger. The birth and immigration are bringing in individuals. Death, I love that picture. And emigration are bringing out individuals so that eventually you could reach a dynamic equilibrium of the ins and outs. And that's when you develop your little S-curve. Lag periods are a big piece. They will have this on the exam. You should write down the formula. It's easy points, right? If you look at the average lag time, you look at the change in the lowest density of the predator and the prey, you subtract them, and the change in the highest density of the predator and the prey, you subtract them, you divide by 2. So if we look at a classic example of lynx and snowshoe hares up in northern Canada, the snowshoes will breed like bunnies, make lots of babies, and then lagging behind them will be the lynx as they got more food. Then they'll get so good at killing the bunnies that the bunnies drop off in their population, and then the lynx kits will start to starve to death and they lag behind it. So you would take the difference between their 2 lows and the difference between their 2 highs, and you would divide by 2, right? Cool. Gauss's law of competitive exclusion, famous example with these paramecium. These both do well. They show logistical growth as they're going in their population until they run out of resources. Put them both together and we get, interspecific competition. And we can see that Aurelia outcompeted the others, probably because it's larger or it has a faster metabolism, but no matter what, there can be only one person or one group of people that are on the varsity team, and the others, they get cut, right? Gauss's law of competitive exclusion. This is a minus kind of relationship, right? Normally you get a 1-minute break, but that's a thing of the past because I'm stuck here by myself. So if we look at survivorship curves that we should write down, 2 things that we got to know. Survivorship curves have K versus R selected species. The K selected, I think of as the kindergarten care. They're slow but sure. That's not what the K stands for, but that's what I think of. When we have kids, we humans take really good care of our kids, so we send them to a few of them to kindergarten. We spend tons of resources. We're talking millions of dollars, and most of them survive, but they take forever to kick out. Like your parents are thinking of kicking you out right now off to college, right? Oh man, college funds, that's even more resources. Then there's the other strategy, which I totally wish we used, called the R-selected individuals. And what they do is they use the recess idea. They supply lots of babies. This is quantity over quality. They make tons of babies, and they, just like the kindergarten teacher, kick them out to recess. And they're like, hey, good luck. And most of them are going to die. So if we look at that, we can see this on curves. Type 1 species are the K-selected species. They tend to live a long time, they mature slowly, and they mate very, very late. So this would be like big mammals, like humans, elephants, whales. They're going to make a few babies, but they're going to spend a lot of energy and help to ensure that they survive. So this is quality over quantity. Type 3 would be things like rabbits. They're going to breed like rabbits, right? Or insects, where you make lots of babies, you don't take very much care of them at all, or none at all, and most of them will die, but you make enough to actually survive the next generation. They tend to live very short lives because they, of course, are striving for survival, and their parents didn't expend a lot of energy on them. Then there is the type 2. The type 2 is kind of in between. This is what birds, rodents have done. They have not one kid, but they have a couple of kids, like a hatch of a bunch of birds or a crush of a bunch of rodents. And they spend medium amounts of energy on them, and they are fairly successful. So this might be a better strategy, might be what way humans want to pursue at most, right? Other things we can see in the book, you can see there's a great example with things like humans being the classic type K or K-selected species, type 1. Type 3 would be things like oysters, where they make tons of babies, send them in the current, good luck, most of them die, right? Or there's the rodent idea, make a fair number of babies, and medium effort, medium amount survive, right? Population math. What you got to know, of course, is birth rate, death rate, and how to calculate a thing, more importantly, called population growth rate. Birth rate is easy. You take the births in 1 year, divided by the total population times 100. Death rate, deaths in 1 year, population times 100, right? The population growth rate's the one they're going to ask. That's the in and out burger. The number born minus the ones that died, the number that came in versus the ones that left, divided by the total population times 100. That would be the one you'd most likely see, right? So think in and out burger, right? And connect the difference between them. Age structure pyramids. They're easy to figure out. And you definitely saw them in Mr. Baker's class, right? So if I look at this population here, you should be able to look at it and say, hey, what's happening? Well, one thing we can see, there's a lot of young individuals. It's balanced between male and female, and there's not a lot of old people. So, hey, a lot of young people are quickly going to mature and reach sexual maturity and start making babies. So this is a population that would be booming, be growing quickly. This would be countries like Kenya, India. This would be the developing world, Brazil, where they're making lots of babies. Those babies then lead to other babies, and suddenly you have too many people that are in poverty that can't actually support themselves. If we think about it in terms of organisms, this is the R-selected strategy. Lots of babies like the rabbits or the insects, don't take much care of them, but they're going to make kids really, really quick. This is a different pyramid. If we look at this pyramid, you can see there's a fair number of both young and the middle age, and there's some people living a pretty old age, right? Well, this is a population that's pretty steady on the side. It's growing slowly because you're still going to have people mature. This would be countries like the United States or Canada or the UK or France, where you have a few kids, you take pretty good care of them. Most of them survive to pretty old age, but you don't overload. The only thing that would change that for the United States would be the fact that you have individuals immigrating in, which is why our population is going up so fast, right? Same for wild populations. With gorillas, they mature late. They have their kids late. They spend a lot of energy on them, so their populations stay fairly stable but grow slowly. The opposite of that, of course, would be a population like this. There's not a lot of young people. That means that the people that are of sexual maturity probably already had kids. And those that are alive and past sexual maturity are now, of course, having kids. Well, not having kids because they're too old to do that. So there's lots of old individuals and very few young individuals. This would be a pyramid that would fall over. This would be a declining population. This would be places like Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Japan, where they have very few kids. Some people decide, hey, kids are expensive and don't have any. Get a robot, right? Or this would be the idea of orcas. Orcas have very few calves. Those calves that they have live a very long time before their maturity. And then, of course, they live even longer and, well, help the individuals in their group to survive. This would be a fairly sophisticated K strategy, which would, be a bit more sustainable. So if we look at those, here's my booming population going to grow quick. Here's my fairly stable population growing slowly. Here's my population that's going to decline over time, which we'd expect to see as people got higher educations and as organisms spent more energy on their young and had less young. Fertility rates. If we look at fertility rates, the total fertility rate is the average total amount of children a woman will have. right? The replacement level fertility is how much of that total fertility rate is required for a population to eventually remain constant or reach K, carrying capacity. For humans, how many children would that be? Well, you got a male and a female. We're sexually reproducing, so that would be 2, but it's actually 2.1 kids. That's because, of course, a percentage of those kids are going to die. So having a few more would help out. And then if you think about places like we live, how many individuals you need to replace it, and you might understand why our population is rising so high, right? Speaking of which, here's a beautiful graph, one of the saddest stories of all of our history. Throughout most of human history, there were not many people on Earth because they kept starving to death or dying from diseases. And then, of course, wonderful things like vaccines came along, but more importantly, this guy came along. This guy, of course, is Fritz Haber. And if we look at Fritz Haber, he came up with a chemical way to pull nitrogen from the sky and make nitrates. Hey, that's fertilizer. You could make ammonia and turn into nitrates. Fertilizer meant that there suddenly could be a lot more food, and the world population skyrocketed. Now, he did that in the later part of the 1800s into the 1900s, and then we had the First World War because there was too many people and not enough land to feed them. And then that continued as we looked at oil being the next resources that we fed ourselves off of, because that's how we make fertilizer and farm and run everything. That led to World War II. So this, of course, means that as our population has continued to skyrocket with more food, we've run into more competition, reduced resources, and well, eventually this just can't keep going. It's not logical. It has to plateau or drop for a while, a boom and bust cycle. But humans will learn that we are biological creatures just like everything else, and we are affected by population cycles. Now, population growth is often said to be the major environmental problem, And that makes sense because 2 people makes more people, which makes more people. And I don't know about you, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want my kid to be that guy. But that's the world that we're heading towards. And it might explain why a little something's going on called COVID-19 right now, where there's too many people and a selective factor has showed up as we express that throughout our bodies, right? Now, normally, of course, we get a nice little break in class, and then we head after ETD 72 parts B and C. So now you can pause me, go up, get some candy, feel good about yourself, and don't think about that population graph, right?